The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for the 2016 Legislative Preview presented by Patrick Cushing of Williams-Mullen. My name is Cassie White. I'm with ACEC of Virginia. Before Patrick gets started today, I'm going to go through a few housekeeping items. Everyone has been placed on mute, so if you have any questions during the webinar, please submit those using the question field. You should see that at the bottom of your toolbar. Just to make sure everyone has access to the question field, can I have you all key in the number of viewers with you? If you're by yourself, just key in the number 1. Otherwise, quickly count the number of viewers with you today and key that into the question field. While everyone's getting that information keyed in, I just want to remind you that at the conclusion of our presentation, we are going to be sending out a brief survey along with a link to watch the recorded version of this webinar. So just in case you miss any of the information, you will have access to the recorded version at the conclusion of today's webinar. So with that being said, Patrick, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Cassie. Well, welcome, everybody, and thanks for joining. I've got several slides, but probably to deviate from those slides a little bit, just to adjust to a few things that have been announced recently here with the state budget and some legislation. But I expect to be done by about 45. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. So we're here to talk about the 2016 legislative session. And I'll do a little bit of a flashback to the 2015 session that will help provide some context. All right. So in this webinar, I'm going to cover a general overview and timeline of the legislative session. I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2016 budget. I'm going to talk about some specific legislation that's going to impact the engineering community. And then I've got time for questions at the end, but if you have questions while I'm presenting, please send those to Cassie, and she'll interrupt me, so I don't mind taking questions in the middle of this presentation. So quick overview. The 2016 session starts on January 13th and scheduled to end on March 12th. This is what we call a long session in Virginia, where we will begin to develop a biennial budget that will cover the next 2 years. And so Virginia oscillates between a long session, which is 60 days, and a short session, which is 45 days. We have, Virginia has one of the shortest sessions in the entire country of state legislatures, and so we move extremely fast once we get started in January with committee and subcommittee meetings starting as early as sometimes 6:30 in the morning, and sometimes going as late as midnight or 1 a.m. So it's very hectic. So to date, about 100 bills have already been filed. Those are bills that you can see online. Yesterday was the deadline by which legislators could submit essentially an unlimited number of bill requests. So I was up in the General Assembly building this morning, and just to give you an idea, on my slide here, you'll see there's 100 bills introduced, and there'll be about another 1,500 to 1,700 introduced when we get into January. But legislators actually request over 3,000 bills that are drafted by the General Assembly staff, really in the latter part of the year. And so there's a lot of legislative ideas that never make it to introduction. And so we'll deal with what will end up being somewhere between 1,700 and 1,900 bills. We'll deal with between January 13th and March 12th. So some major issues that we know are coming this year, and I'm going to cover very broadly what I think are going to be the big issues. K-12, so education reforms and funding. There's been a lot of talk of reforms to the SOL and how we test students and the number of tests that we put on K-12 students. There'll be a major constitutional amendment that would authorize the Board of Education to permit charter schools. And then, of course, another big issue is going to be funding for teachers and school districts. Another big issue the budget broadly, but a lot of budget issues are going to be tied to Medicaid expansion. So when the healthcare law passed several years ago, states were given the option of whether they wanted to expand coverage under Medicaid to certain populations of children, elderly, and low-income individuals. Virginia, and it's an option for states, and if they accept it, then they get a large amount of federal monies. I think in Virginia it's a couple billion. But then the state has right now a cost share of 10%, and so there is a cost to the state, but then that also comes with several $billions in funding. It's something the governor has been pushing since he came into office, and it's something that our Republican-controlled General Assembly is adamantly against. Excuse me. And so this year, the renewed effort, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a later slide, the governor will put into his budget Medicaid expansion, and he has already offered a number of what I will call bargaining chips to the Republicans to see if he can get that through. The next kind of big thing, and this is somewhat related to the architectural and engineering community, is economic development spending. Right now, the governor really has done a great job attracting businesses and growing businesses in Virginia, leveraging work done by obviously previous governors in the General Assembly, but he has, I think, fairly stood out as a governor that has worked really hard to develop and attract businesses to Virginia. With that, there's some deals that some members of the General Assembly feel like maybe were not the best investment, and so I know the governor is going to be coming back looking for more money that he can use to attract businesses to Virginia, and I think that there will probably be a robust discussion over how that money is to be used, what type of transparency is involved, and how that money gets spent to attract companies. And just this morning, I was at a briefing up at the General business development entities in the state, watched them get grilled by a largely Republican panel. So it will be a contentious issue this session. Another issue, again, somewhat in some aspects related to the architectural and engineering community, privacy issues, really for interest to the engineering community is the use of unmanned systems or drones. Individuals and private businesses use unmanned systems. And of course, that's going to be impacted by what happens at the federal level with some proposed rulemaking that's coming out that was supposed to already be out but is not out yet, related to how commercial entities can use unmanned systems. But privacy issues in general continue to be a robust topic from all different aspects, from private users to law enforcement users. So this will be another issue that we'll have a robust discussion this year. And then for engineering firms, the biggest is going to be related to procurement reforms. The past couple of years, we've seen far more proposed changes to the Virginia Public Procurement Act and the procurement in general than the past several years before that. And so I'll talk more specifically about the procurement reforms in a later slide. So going back to an overview of the budget, the governor will introduce his budget on December 17th, so we're only about a week and a half away from that, and that will set the tone for the legislative session. Once the governor introduces his budget, he loses control. So that budget has actually already been finalized. It's not public. When he hands that over to the General Assembly on December 17th, it's the House Appropriations and Senate Finance Committees in the House and Senate respectively that each get a copy of the governor's budget, and then they propose their amendments to those budgets. So that is usually a significant process, and I would expect to see a lot of markups to the governor's budget this year, particularly because it includes the Medicaid expansion, and then with the Medicaid expansion, a lot of revenues that the governor would be appropriating. And so expect to see a lot of changes to that. And then once the General Assembly in March, hopefully March, agrees on a budget, it goes back to the governor for further amendment and veto. And then in April, it goes back to the General Assembly for final approval. So it's a back and forth process. The point that I want to get across to everybody is it is a very detailed process that really takes from the governor working on the budget beginning in June all the way through April of the following year. So it's almost a 12-year cycle to really to draft, amend, and sign a budget bill. So the budget outlook, earlier in the summer, the governor announced that revenues are increasing. So good revenue numbers from the Department of Tax. And then midsummer, governor continued to deliver good news on revenue. And then about 2 weeks ago, the House Appropriations Committee and Senate Finance Committees met respectively, and the House Appropriation projects $453 million above the forecasted revenue, and the Senate Finance Committee projected $746 million above forecast. This is all really good news considering really since the economic downturn in 2007, 2008, we really have not had many years where we've seen revenues exceed forecast. So usually this time of year, the discussion for the past several years has been what is going to be cut in the budget. And this year, there won't be any budget cuts across the board. Now, legislators and the governor are looking where are they going to be spending more money and where are they going to invest. And the reason that you see different numbers here for the House Appropriations and Senate Finance Committee is the House Appropriations Committee typically takes a more conservative view on what they estimate revenues would be, and the Senate Finance Committee usually has a higher estimate. But the big news is the budget is healthy, and that's good for Virginia. Okay, now let me talk a little bit about the legislation impacting the engineering community. I'm going to talk about procurement reform, and in doing that, it's going to be helpful for me to remind everybody what we did last year, and then talk about what we have going into 2016. I'm going to talk a little bit about transportation funding and project prioritization for those individuals interested in the transportation sector, and then a little bit on dam safety. So in 2015, there were identical bills, HB 1835 and SB 1371, that passed and became law. And those were two omnibus bills, and by omnibus I mean they contained a number of different Procurement Act changes, and those were the result of a 2-year study in which the VPPA was reviewed by a panel of private sector representatives and public sector representatives. I sat on the panel on behalf of ACEC and AIA, and then there were a number of other local governments and public entities, individuals from the contracting side, and some other various individuals involved in procurement, such as the Attorney General's office. So the big picture from those two bills were, I would consider those a significant win for the A&E community. We had originally gone into that 2-year study process looking to make several changes to strengthen the qualification-based selection process that we have kind of codified into the competitive negotiation provision of code. But when we got to the table, we found out there were a number of local governments and other public entities that were looking to really erode some of the protections that QBS offers, primarily by looking to introduce price earlier into the discussion, and several other different changes, such as expanding cooperative procurement to A&E services. So we successfully defeated all of those efforts. Some of the things that we were affirmatively able to do is prohibit price shopping in a term contract. So for those who have experienced working under a term contract, what we had heard is there were some public entities that were soliciting firms for a term contract for A&E services. Let's just say 8 firms responded. 8 firms were awarded the term contract, and then the public entity would go back under that term contract and then ask each of the firms for a price for a specific service. And that was essentially a bypass of the qualifications-based selection process. So we were successful in getting some language to prohibit price shopping in a term contract. Incidentally, if you see in your practices a public entity doing that, where it's blatant, where they're just fishing for price from all the firms under a term contract, please contact Nancy at ACEC, and she will send them a letter with our new code language that says they can't do that. Another thing that we did was defended against the expansion of job order contracting, and I apologize for just throwing that acronym in there. But job order contracting is a new type of contracting in Virginia. It's been used at the federal level for a while, and in quick summary, job order contracting uses a consultant to develop a preset book of prices for various types of small construction and maintenance projects, like painting, replacing light bulbs, installing doors, windows, that type of thing. And as originally introduced, the advocates of this job order contracting wanted to allow architectural and engineering services to be listed in this book of prices at a fixed fee. And so we successfully limited that to only incidental type of work related to construction, and then there's a very stringent cap on the total dollar amount of A&E services that can be procured through that type of contract. So that was something new that we saw for the first time last year, and I think we're in a good position. It's something that we're going to keep an eye on this year, as I have heard from various different people that at some point in time the primary consultants that do this type of work are interested in raising that cap. And then finally, from last session, there was a bill that redefines what a small business means in Virginia. And so for those familiar with it, I'll hold off, and I think I have another slide later on when I talk about what the legislation will do this year. But long story short, that bill was passed, but it was sent to a study and has to be passed again this coming session before it becomes effective. And then the final bill I want to talk about from last year was actually an ACEC bill that Reggie Jones and I and Nancy and others worked on, and that was House Bill 1540. Our bill sought to do 2 things, and these were 2 things that we proposed to the original study committee, but were not adopted as recommendations, primarily because the study group was dominated by public entities, which was unfortunate for us. The first thing that our bill sought to do was eliminate the use of non-binding estimates. So our argument going into the General Assembly was we have a qualification-based selection process in Virginia that fairly puts the discussion of price into the negotiation phase, which happens after the most qualified firms are ranked. However, there is language that allows a public entity to discuss the non-binding estimates of projects with the A&E firms prior to ranking. That language has been in the code since the early 80s when the Public Procurement Act was first enacted. But what we have seen over time is, and this is particularly in local governments, is a discussion of non-binding estimates taking place during the discussion phase, and that's being done on limited scope proposals where firms don't have a good idea of what the price really would be until they get further down the road in discussions. And then what we've seen is anecdotal evidence of firms looking to, public bodies looking to rank firms or include in the ranking process the use of these non-binding estimates to try to get some of the low-priced firms at the top of the qualifications list. And we've heard firms come, public entities come to us and say, well, what's wrong with using price to rank firms on qualifications? And of course, we go into the whole process on how we're looking to protect the public interest, the value of looking at qualifications, the history of the Brooks Act at the federal level, and why we have qualification-based selection in Virginia. And so that was our first component of the bill. The second component of the bill was language that would eliminate the ability of a public body to incorporate a request for amendments to terms and conditions in an RFP. So there are two practices that we saw with the procurement process for A&E services. One of those was an RFP comes out, and in that RFP, it clearly states, if you submit a proposal to this RFP, you will have deemed to accept this contract and all these other different referenced statutory provisions and policy manuals and other types of documents. And what we have heard is that many of those contracts contain provisions that were, simply uninsurable. They were requiring duties to defend that were outside the scope of practice of what is typically done. And so, so what we ended up with were qualified firms that were telling us that they couldn't respond to procurements because the mere submission of a proposal meant that they had to accept all these terms and conditions that were really onerous on the community, and in a lot of respects, in some cases, just didn't apply to A&E services. So that was one problem. The second problem that we've heard about is a public entity putting out an RFP, attaching the contract to the RFP, and saying, we're going to score your proposal, but we're going to score 20 points out of 100 is going to be to what extent do you agree to our terms and conditions. So this requirement that you mark up the terms and conditions and that scoring process being used to help determine the most qualified firm didn't make sense and is really an erosion of the qualifications-based selection process. And so we had language that would say essentially any discussion of the terms and conditions has to be moved to the negotiation phase in order to preserve the integrity of the qualifications-based selection process, and that when firms are being ranked, shortlisted and ranked, it's being done so on whether they are qualified, which is based on their experience, their references, their approach to the project, and so forth. So unfortunately, that bill failed on second reading. We made great progress in terms of the committees that bill went to. We came out of the House General Laws Committee with a healthy vote. We came out of the Appropriations Committee with a healthy vote. And unfortunately, local governments really found this to be a problem, and they motivated some of their key local governments and their leaders within local government to call their General Assembly members, and we lost the bill on second reading on the House floor. Learning from that situation, we are going to approach this issue again in 2016. So we're going to be pursuing, ACEC and AIA, our partner, is going to be pursuing a bill similar to House Bill 1540, but we're only going to be seeking to amend the code to move consideration of terms and conditions to the negotiation phase. We are not going to propose any changes to the use of non-binding estimates this year. We went for a lot last year, and we didn't get it. So we're coming back, and we're going to take a slower approach to the changes that we want to make and focus on the terms and conditions issue this year. We have worked with DGS and local governments over the course of the summer to try to come to some agreement on language. But right now, the local government representatives do not support moving discussion of terms and conditions to the negotiation phase. I would say that DGS was skeptical, but in speaking with two of the key people at DGS on this issue this morning, I'm hoping that they will not take a position on this bill. For those that have run procurements with Department of General Services, you probably know that they do not ask for you to mark up or score. They don't score amendments to terms and conditions in a contract until the negotiation phase. And that's because they're in the position of, this is the contract. If you want it, great. If not, we'll move to the next. That's how it should work. And so I think that they will ultimately, I'm hoping, remain neutral on this bill. But Reggie and I and Nancy and member firms of ACEC as well as AIA have already met with a number of the key legislators on the two committees in the House and Senate this bill would go to. We've met with leadership, the chairman of both of those committees, and we already have a good level of support for this bill. And so this will be our big issue for 2016 for the engineering community, is moving the consideration of terms and conditions to the negotiation phase. So let me go back, and I talked about a bill from last year that changed the definition of small business, and the bill will be back this year. And just to give you a summary of where it's been, the current definition of small business in the Code of Virginia is if your business has gross receipts under $10 million or under 250 employees. So you can qualify in either of those situations as a small business. And for those procurements that score a SWAM component, this is extremely important. The new proposed definition that has been proposed after a study that took place over the course of the summer is to follow the federal SBA definition. And what that means is, for those that don't do federal work, the SBA uses industry codes, NAICS industry codes, to determine which industry the procurement or the business is operating in. And for each different business or industry, there's a different gross receipts measure as to whether you're a small business or not. So, for example, for engineering firms, I think it's 14 million. You have to be under 14 million in gross receipts. And for architecture firms, I think it's under 7 million. And so this will be important to watch as it goes through the General Assembly, because engineering and architecture firms are going to be under different definitions of small business. Now, this is something that just at its basic level, ACEC and AIA have been monitoring this but have not taken a position on these changes because of the impact to both large firms, small firms, and then also mid-sized firms. but I think it's going to be very important for individual firms to pay attention to what's going on with the definition. The one thing that I will say also about the proposed changes that are going to come in the form of a bill this year is there will be a delayed effective date so that the implementation of the new definitions is not going to take place for essentially another 2 years. And so those firms that are already designated as a small business in Virginia will be able to retain that definition under a grandfather clause. So we're really looking at from basically 2018 out, these new definitions really taking full force. And of course, I've got some other information here that I think is important context. Just to give you perspective, under the current definition of small business in Virginia, 96% qualify as small. And then another important thing to remember is impacting all of this is that the governor has a goal to hit 42% of all public procurements awarded to SWAM businesses. So the change in definition is definitely important, but it is the goal of what the governor wants to award to SWAM businesses, which shows you how it's going to be implemented. And so the reason that we're looking at a delayed effective date, in my opinion, is because there's been a lot of controversy over this 42%. And so I think the administration, and we'll see about the General Assembly, has been reluctant to change anything quickly. So important considerations for individual firms, something important to monitor, especially if you are currently designated as a small business in Virginia. Some additional procurement legislation in 2016. The contractor community is going to have some legislation related to the use of CM at risk, construction management at risk. There's a group of contractors out there who believe that public entities are using CM at risk inappropriately, and they feel as if they are being cut out of the procurement process because of the sophistication and some of the financial requirements needed to run a project under CM at risk. The other thing that we're going to see, and we see these every year, this is a perennial issue, is different types of term contracts have caps on them for different types of public entities. And so we continue to see public entities want to raise those limits. So for example, a public entity, local government can have a term contract, but certain local governments are capped at a $500,000 term limit for that contract, and some are capped at $6 million. And so we're consistently seeing other public entities want to raise those caps. It makes it easier for the public entities to procure once and then keep firms under that term contract to avoid having to go back out to procurement. Typically, we have opposed raising some of these caps because it has a negative consequence to competition. So it limits competition. It prevents procurements from going out. And so we've opposed those in the past. And then finally, something that is not going to be in this coming legislative session, but very soon after the session ends, the Joint Legislative Audit Review Commission is going to continue its study of state contracting. Over the past year, JLARC, which is the legislative watchdog group, has been working on a study related to how state agencies and institutions of higher education are procuring goods, services, and professional services. And so we met with them earlier this summer. Many of you have probably received a survey from them, but we met with them to bring up some of the issues that we see in public contracting from the A&E community. And those are primarily related to the use of non-binding estimates, to the consideration of amendments to terms and conditions in the ranking process, and how both of those practices really erode the qualifications-based selection we have in Virginia. And so we'll be monitoring that study and expect a report out in late 2016. To say a little bit about transportation funding. For those tracking transportation funding, 2 years ago there was a major change in how the gas tax operates in Virginia, and it was changed from a fixed per gallon fee to a % of wholesale price. And in doing that, the General Assembly set a floor for the wholesale price of gas. So in the calculation of the gas tax, the wholesale price could never drop below $3.19. And it's great that they did that, because if we were calculating the gas tax on the wholesale price now, we'd be doing it at $1.50-ish a gallon, and so we would have totally eroded our transportation funding from state revenue standpoint. So that was a very good foresight by the General Assembly. But what they did not do is put a floor on the regional gas taxes in Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads. And as a result of the significant drop in gas prices, both regions, Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads, have revenue shortfalls from the forecast that was produced when this bill passed. And so there will be an effort by both regions to put a floor back into the regional gas tax. And for example, if it was set at the $3.19 that the statewide tax was set, I think each region stands to get somewhere between $40 and $80 million in additional revenue a year. So a significant amount of money. And then finally, HB2 from the 2014 session was our bill that required the Commonwealth Transportation Board to rank road and transit projects based on a number of factors to determine what's the best use of money. And so that process is underway for current projects that are being funded from here forward. And I have heard, and others have heard, some discontent among some legislators, some in rural areas who feel like this formula is weighted towards the urban areas. And so we may see an effort to make some changes to that project prioritization process. This is where I insert my obligatory dam safety slide. I had it in my presentation last year, and I will keep it in because for those engineers that work on dams, this is very important. The more stringent regulations that came through DCR several years ago have, for good reason, created a very difficult situation for dam landowners who now have dams, local governments, community associations that have dams that are not compliant with the current regulations because of the inherent dangers downstream of those dams. And so we continue to see probably every year some bill related to dam safety. And those are really coming from local governments and other dam owners who don't want to comply with the new regulations or can't afford to comply from their perspective. And with that, I've left a decent amount of time for questions. The only, I'll give everybody a few minutes to think about that. The only other thing that I would say is we are very actively working right now on our legislation related to the terms and conditions consideration in an RFP in the procurement process. It is a bill that I think, from everything that I have heard, would have a very positive impact on the engineering community for those firms that are doing work in the public sector. And so to the extent that you see updates on those, I know last year we made a solicitation for firms to come down to the General Assembly to meet with legislators we may end up doing the same thing this year, so just keep an eye out for that. And that's the legislative preview. Cassie, do we have any questions?
We have not received any questions just yet, but we do have sufficient time if anyone has anything that they would like clarification on. While Patrick's here, please feel free to submit those questions and we can get him to answer those with us today. If not, please feel free to either reach out to myself, Nancy, or Patrick with any questions that you think of following the webinar. We are going to pause for just a minute to let you digest all this information, and if you have any questions, feel free to key those in.
Yeah, and Cassie, while people are thinking, one of the things that I think is going to be interesting to watch with the state budget is because we have potential for a significant additional amount of revenue, universities, state agencies, the Virginia Port Authority, and some other large infrastructure owners are looking to the General Assembly for some very significant amounts of money for construction projects. And so in terms of the pipeline of business in the public sector, I think we'll probably see a greater pipeline than we have in the past simply because we have more money, and that's going to flow down to agencies, and it's going to flow down to local governments to some extent. And so, there will be, I believe, a couple different bond packages that are proposed this year for major infrastructure improvements, and I think that's going to be something that the engineering community is going to want to watch and kind of get an early indication of what agencies have what monies to spend. And so the state budget is a great resource in terms of a business development pipeline to keep an eye on what's going on.
We did get a quick question. It's for clarification on the federal small business limit. Can you clarify if it's $15 million or $16 million?
Oh, I'd have to look it up. I'm not sure. It's either 14, 15, or 16 million. I apologize for not having it on the top of my head. But a quick Google of the federal SBA definition limit for engineering firms, I think, should probably yield the result. And just to give my perspective on where that bill has been in the study group, I've been monitoring it, and the National Federation of Independent Businesses, AGC, the technology community, obviously ACEC, AIA, and a number of other stakeholders have been involved in that study, and I don't think anybody has opposed moving to the SBA definition. I think really what most interested stakeholders are concerned about really is what impact is this goal of 42% going to have? That's question number one. And question number two is, how are we actually going to implement this? How do I know if in one project, if I'm an engineering firm, and another project, can I be an architecture firm? Or is it going to change for those companies that operate under a number of different NAICS codes? Is there going to be a primary designation? Are you going to have a secondary designation? So I think that there's still a lot of work to be done on the implementation side, and I think that's where most people have focused their comments. Is there's no outright opposition to the change. It's just, how are you going to implement this? And so part of the compromise, I think, was kind of delaying the implementation of this through a grandfather clause for another 2 years.
Well, thank you, Patrick. We are going to pause for another few minutes just in case anyone has any other questions that they can think of. Otherwise, that does conclude our webinar for today. Just as a reminder, we are going to send you a quick survey along with a link so you can view this webinar again, just in case you want to share it with any colleagues. Another question just popped up. Patrick, what percentage of engineering firms would fall under the 15 million limit? I think they're referring to that federal small business limit.
Right. I don't know how many Virginia firms would fall under that 15 million, but what I can tell you, and I just would have to speak very broadly here, and that is when you look at the old definition, you're a small business if you're under 10 million in gross revenue or you're under 250 employees. The vast majority, I think the vast majority of companies that qualified as a small business were doing it because they were under 250 employees. And so I don't know how that relates down to the engineering companies. I think I had talked to Nancy about trying to get some of that information about, what's going to be the exact impact to the engineering companies. So it's a good question because it'd be good to know who qualifies under the current definition and then how many firms would qualify under the SBA definition, and we don't have an easy answer to that question. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Patrick, and thanks again for your time today. Again, if anyone has any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to either myself, Nancy Israel with ACEC Virginia, or with Patrick. And I'll be sharing all of our contact information along with a survey and a link to watch this webinar again. But that concludes our webinar for today. Thank you all for joining us. Have a good afternoon.
All right, thank you.